There was one thing you could say about washboards. They were tough and never seemed to bend or break. That's because the corrugation gave it tremendous strength. And that's one reason why some aircraft, like this one, were built with corrugated aluminum skin. The most famous such aircraft, of course, was the Ford trimotor, affectionately known as the Tin Goose. Now, don't get me wrong. This isn't a Ford, even though it looks just like one. This is a Bushmaster 2000, and it was built in 1985 using the same tooling that was used to build the original Ford. Now, the idea was to build a reliable machine for carrying hefty loads in and out of the bush. But the Bushmaster Corporation failed after only 2 of these aircraft were built. It's interesting to note that the Bushmaster incorporates numerous refinements, such as this relatively modern cowling. But despite all the improvements, including 150 extra horsepower, the airplane still only cruises at 100 knots. In a dive, it goes a little bit faster. The largest of the original Fords was powered by a trio of 400 horsepower Pratt & Whitney Wasp engines. But each of these Pratt & Whitney power plants provide 450 horsepower. Now, these large tires, well, they're the same size as you'd find on a Boeing 737, and they make it easy for the Bushmaster to operate from soft, unimproved fields. As you can see, the tail wheel assembly is large, built like something from a Mack truck or a tank. Matter of fact, the whole airplane is rugged, which explains why none of the Ford trimotors ever had an accident because of structural failure. The trimotor Ford was designed by Bill Stout, and 200 of them were built between 1926 and 1933. It carried 12 passengers who were served cold sandwiches and water from thermos bottles. In the cockpit, there were only 13 instruments, and the large wooden control wheels were identical to those used to steer the deluxe Model T Ford. But the airlines dropped the trimotor like a hot rivet following the appearance in 1933 of the Boeing 247, shortly after which came the DC-1, 2, and 3. As you can see, this humongous door can accommodate almost any kind of a load. Before we can fly this machine, we're of course going to have to check the fuel, just like on any other aircraft. So come on, hop inside and we'll do it together. You probably thought I was nuts when I said that we checked the fuel from inside the airplane. But in a way, that's exactly what we have to do. Now, the first step is to remove this panel, then reach up and open the hatch and bring it down inside the airplane. And then we take this custom-built ladder, made just for the purpose, install it like so, and like so. And now for the fun part, for other people, not for me, is to climb up this very unstable ladder and haul oneself out onto the roof. Boy, the view from up here is really nice, but not if you suffer from acrophobia. You do get a wonderful sense of how large this airplane really is. Well, let's get down to business and see just how much fuel we have. Each of these 3 tanks hold 122 gallons. That means total fuel capacity is 366 gallons, of which 360 are usable. Well, this tank has got plenty, a little over 100 gallons. We've got about 300 gallons on board, and that should be enough for our flight today. Oh, the Bushmaster only burns about 60 gallons an hour. Passengers on a trimotor were treated to an innovation in air travel. Each one was given a headset and could listen to radio broadcasts while in flight. But the true purpose of the headset was to help muffle some of the ear-splitting noise generated by the engines, echoing throughout the all-metal cabin, which had very little insulation. Now, the Bushmaster doesn't have much insulation either. Matter of fact, this machine is more efficient at converting fuel into noise than any airplane I've ever flown. It really gets loud in here, as you'll soon hear for yourself.
Although this is a large 3-engine airplane, it's relatively simple both in construction and operation. There's no flaps to worry about, no retractable landing gear, and the fuel system is surprisingly simple too. We normally feed from each tank to its respective engine, but the fuel valves are in kind of a strange place. They're back here on this bulkhead, and here's the valve for tank number 3, number 2, and number 1. At first glance, the center pedestal looks a bit confusing, sort of like a forest of levers, but that's just because there are 3 engines. Now these are the throttles, these are the propeller pitch controls, these are the carburetor heat controls, and these are the mixture controls, which we can now shove into the full rich position for starting. Now there's really not much unusual in the cockpit, except for this placard over here. It indicates rather clearly that this airplane is not certificated for flight into visible moisture. Now this is the only airplane I've ever flown that can't be operated in rain or even light drizzle. Don't ask, I don't know why. Well anyway, let's get this beast fired up. Okay, looks like we're cleared to turn number 1. Pump on, prime. There we go. Number 1's turning and the number 1 pump is now off. Okay, now we'll start number 2. Pump is on, hit the starter, hit the primer, magneto's on. There goes number 2. Okay, and now we'll turn number 3. There goes the starter, and the pump, and the primer, and the mags. Off. We got 3 good starts. This airplane has a 78-foot wingspan, so you really have to be careful about taxiing in close quarters. It's even possible to taxi into an area you can't get out of. One nice thing about the Bushmaster is that the wings are so high that they pass over nearby airplanes and they don't get in your way. Now the run-up is fairly conventional and pretty simple. The only thing you really have to be careful about is overheating the engines during prolonged ground operations. Santa Monica Tower, Bushmaster 750 Romeo Whiskey is ready for takeoff on runway 3.
Bushmaster 0 Romeo Whiskey, taxi in position and halt.
Okay, now it's time to grab a fistful of throttles and get going. Now once we're lined up on the runway, all we have to do is lock the tail wheel so that we don't get any directional surprises.
Bushmaster 0 Romeo Whiskey, clear for takeoff.
0 Romeo Whiskey's rolling. Once the tri-motor begins to roll, don't worry about rotating the nose. When she hits the right speed, she just sort of levitates. The Bushmaster has a dramatic climb angle, primarily because it climbs so slowly, at only 64 knots, while its rate of climb is usually around 1,100 feet per minute. The best rate of climb speed in this thing is only 55 knots, so you can really get a hellacious climb angle. Although it seems to take forever to get somewhere in a Bushmaster, it doesn't take long to travel, I'd say about 50 years or so back in time, to see what it was like to travel in America's first all-metal transport. The original Ford tri-motor had 220 horsepower Wright Whirlwind engines and sold for $42,000. Now, a more luxuriously appointed model with the more powerful Pratt & Whitney engines had a price tag of $65,000. But remember, This was during an era when a brand new Model A Ford Roadster sold for only $345. Although the tri-motor is fun to fly, it's not fun to fly for very long. The controls are really heavy. When you move the ailerons and rudder to begin a turn, for example, the airplane just ponders the situation. It's as though she needed time to figure out what you want. And then very, very slowly, she'll comply. Somebody once said that the tri-motor has the control sensitivity and response of a P-51 with its control locks in place. Here, let me give you an example of what I mean. Watch what happens when I quickly move the ailerons back and forth between their limits. You see? Nothing happens. And it's the same way with the elevator and the rudder. Now take a look and you'll see what I mean. I mean, nothing happens. Now there's the elevator. Let's try the rudder. Like I said, you have to move the controls and then wait, and wait, and wait. Well, let's head back to the barn for a landing or two, okay? The pilot's operating handbook recommends that high-speed descents, that's a joke, that high-speed descents be made by idling the outboard engines and keeping power up on the center engine. A normal approach in a Bushmaster is made at about 70 knots. Minimum controllable airspeed, or VMC, with an inoperative outboard engine is only 50 knots. So losing an engine on the approach is no big deal. Matter of fact, losing an engine on takeoff is no big deal either. The airplane is so overpowered, at least with respect to takeoff and climb performance, that you can take off from a standing start with any one of the three engines shut down. One nice thing about the tri-motor is that it's so big, its size makes it easy for others in the traffic pattern to see you. But the flapless 852 square foot wing is so large that the airplane just doesn't want to come down, even with all engines idling. One thing that you do have to worry about is stabilizing the aircraft on final approach and avoiding gusty crosswinds. The airplane is so unresponsive, especially at slow speed, that it can become impossible to cope with really strong gusts.
Making a full stall or three-point landing isn't very difficult, as long as you've been building your forearms by curling 50-pound weights. Bringing the wheel fully aft is a strenuous effort, and for most people is a two-handed operation. Where did she come from?